The Sophia shift. Very few empaths ever talk about it because very few ever fully reach it. In the beginning, empathy feels like a blessing. You understand emotions without words. You absorb energy instantly. You care deeply, sometimes more deeply than the people around you. But as Carl Jung once warned, any gift that remains unconscious can eventually control the person who carries it. And this is where the real transformation begins. The Sophia shift happens the moment an empath stops existing for everyone else and starts becoming aware of the deeper psychology behind everything around them. They still feel deeply, but they stop chasing people who pull away. They still love, but they no longer believe it is their responsibility to rescue everyone. They recognize manipulation almost immediately, and instead of arguing or defending themselves, they quietly detach. This is the stage where empathy turns into inner power, not aggressive power, not controlling power. Quiet power, controlled power. And the truth is, most empaths never arrive here because reaching this stage requires destroying the version of yourself that needed validation through being needed. Most empaths are raised to believe their self-sacrifice is a virtue. They become the calm one, the patient one, the understanding one, the person who listens for hours, the one who forgives too quickly, the one who absorbs tension just to keep peace around them. From the outside, it appears mature, compassionate, even emotionally intelligent. But Jung spoke about something dangerous beneath this behavior, the persona. The persona is the identity we build to survive acceptance. It becomes the mask we wear so people will love us, need us, or approve of us. And many empaths become trapped inside that mask without realizing it. They become addicted to being the good one, the understanding one, the emotionally available one. Over time, they stop allowing themselves to express anger honestly. They apologize for their disappointment. They explain every boundary as if they need permission to have one. What appears to be kindness is often fear hidden beneath politeness. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being labeled difficult. This is where the illusion starts collapsing. Because true compassion does not require self-erasure. Yet many empaths mistake suffering for love. They believe patience means tolerating disrespect. They believe forgiveness must happen instantly, even when trust has been shattered. They silence their instincts just to avoid conflict. Jung would describe this as shadow repression. The shadow contains the parts of ourselves we were taught to hide. Anger, assertiveness, self-protection, the ability to say no. When empaths reject these qualities, they bury them deep inside the unconscious mind. But buried emotions never disappear. They transform into exhaustion, resentment, emotional burnout, and silent bitterness. That is why so many empaths feel constantly drained. Not because they love too much, but because they suppress too much. They spend years managing everyone else's emotional world while abandoning their own. What they call empathy is often hypervigilance, constantly monitoring moods, expressions, tone shifts, and reactions in order to stay emotionally safe. At first, the world rewards this behavior. People admire how patient they are. Friends depend on them. Partners lean on them emotionally. Family members expect endless understanding. But eventually, something inside begins to ache. The empath notices they are always adjusting themselves for others, always shrinking parts of their truth to make other people comfortable. And slowly, a painful realization appears. They are loved more for their usefulness than for their authenticity. That realization shakes everything because it threatens the identity they spent years building. If they stop overgiving, will people still stay? If they become direct, will they lose connection? If they stop performing emotional labor for everyone, who will they become? That question marks the beginning of the Sophia shift. The transformation starts when the empath begins questioning their own compulsive niceness. Not their heart, not their values, but the automatic habit of abandoning themselves to maintain approval. They begin noticing how often they say yes when they internally mean no. They notice how quickly they excuse unhealthy behavior. They recognize the painful gap between what they truly feel and what they allow themselves to say. And that awareness is uncomfortable because it forces them to admit something difficult. Much of their kindness was built from survival. But this is also where healing begins. The empath slowly learns they can feel anger without becoming cruel. They can create boundaries without becoming selfish. They can disappoint people without losing their worth. And as this integration happens, they stop reacting automatically. They pause before agreeing. They stop over-explaining themselves. They allow silence instead of rushing to fix tension. And suddenly some people become uncomfortable. The people who benefited from the empath's self-abandonment often pull away first. They say things like, "You've changed," and they are right. The empath has changed into someone whole, someone integrated, someone who can carry both compassion and strength at the same time, because the most powerful empath is not the one who feels the deepest. It is the one who finally stops betraying themselves just to be accepted. This is not coincidence, and it is not bad luck. It is a repeating unconscious pattern playing itself out beneath awareness. Carl Jung believed that the hidden forces of the psyche quietly shape human life until they are brought into consciousness. As he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. For the empath, the turning point begins when life stops feeling random and starts feeling patterned. Something inside begins to shift. The empath notices the same emotional dynamics repeating in different forms, different people, same wounds, different relationships, same exhaustion. And for the first time, the question changes. Instead of asking, "Why do people always hurt me?" they begin asking, "Why do I keep allowing this to continue?" That question changes everything. They realize their sensitivity was never the problem. The real issue was the lack of protection around it. Empathy became an open door given freely to people who never earned access. This awareness is painful at first, even confronting, because it reveals moments of self-betrayal disguised as kindness. But real awakening requires honesty. Eventually, emotional burnout becomes the breaking point. Not simple tiredness, but deep exhaustion from constant self-abandonment, years of suppressing needs, swallowing disappointment, and maintaining peace at the cost of truth. One day, the empath can no longer perform. They cannot keep smiling through collapse or pretending to be fine. The internal mask begins to crack, and when it breaks, the shadow emerges, anger surfaces, frustration becomes unavoidable. Guilt may follow because they were taught that anger is wrong or unkind. But this anger is not destruction, it is revelation. It shows where boundaries were crossed, where silence replaced self-respect, and where peace was maintained at personal cost. This is the moment unconscious patterns begin turning conscious. The empath starts tracing behaviors back to early conditioning, learning that love had to be earned through usefulness, that peace required self-suppression, that being good meant being easy, available, and selfless. These patterns once ensured survival. Now they create limitation. At this point, a choice appears: continue the cycle or confront it. Carl Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming whole. It begins not in comfort, but in collapse. When illusions fall away, the empath realizes that endless giving did not guarantee love, that avoidance of conflict did not prevent loss, and that being needed was never the same as being valued. That realization is painful but freeing. Once the pattern is visible, it loses its unconscious control. Empathy begins to shift. Instead of automatically absorbing everyone else's emotions, the empath starts turning inward. They pause before reacting. They ask, "Is this mine to carry?" They begin to evaluate instead of absorb. This is not emotional coldness. It is discernment. The breaking point does not destroy empathy, it refines it. Sensitivity becomes awareness instead of survival. Pain becomes information instead of identity. The empath stops asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" and starts asking, "What is this showing me about myself?" That question marks the beginning of real transformation. Then comes shadow integration, the stage where strength and softness finally coexist. Jung described the shadow as the parts of ourselves we reject: anger, assertiveness, self-interest, emotional distance. Empaths often suppress these traits to preserve their identity as kind, understanding, and gentle. But rejection creates imbalance. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-destruction. Integration begins when anger is no longer feared. Not acted on recklessly, not weaponized, simply acknowledged. Because anger is not the enemy of empathy. It is often the signal that something within has been violated for too long. When the empath accepts this, their anger becomes clarity. It reveals where they overextended, where they tolerated disrespect, and where they abandoned themselves for connection. And slowly, they stop apologizing for their strength. Silence becomes calm, boundaries become simple. Emotional manipulation becomes easier to recognize. They no longer chase closure or approval. They respond with intention instead of urgency. This is why the integrated empath feels different. Not because they are cruel, but because they are no longer blind. They see guilt tactics instantly. They recognize emotional games without confusion. They no longer define their worth through approval, and people feel that shift immediately. The empath who once overgave now stands grounded, selective, and internally steady. because they are no longer afraid of their own power. Before shadow integration, power often feels unsafe to an empath. It gets associated with dominance, control, and emotional aggression, so they instinctively step away from it. They learn to stay gentle, agreeable, and non-threatening, believing that power contradicts kindness. But real psychological strength works differently. True power comes from integration. It comes from recognizing you could cause harm, yet choosing restraint. It comes from understanding your emotional depth without being consumed by it. It comes from setting boundaries that do not rely on anger or conflict to hold their ground. When this realization settles in, the empath stops shrinking themselves to stay safe or likable. They no longer dilute their truth just to keep harmony. They begin speaking with clarity when needed, and stepping back the moment respect disappears. Once an empath integrates their shadow, manipulation loses its grip. Manipulation only works through blind spots, guilt, fear of rejection, and the need for approval. When those internal triggers are seen clearly and understood, they no longer control behavior. The empath doesn't lose sensitivity. They still feel deeply, still understand others with precision, still care. But empathy is no longer unprotected. It is balanced with discernment. Compassion is now supported by inner strength. They are no longer split between being kind and being powerful. They embody both at once. Before this shift, an empath absorbs emotional environments without filters. They walk into a room and instantly register tension, discomfort, or disappointment. But instead of observing it, they take it in as their own. If someone is anxious, they become anxious. If someone is upset, they feel responsible for it. Their nervous system reacts before their mind can interpret what is happening. This creates deep perception, but also emotional overload. They confuse absorption with connection, believing that carrying emotions proves closeness. Over time, they begin holding emotional states that never belonged to them, fixing issues they were never responsible for, reacting to every emotional signal as if it requires intervention. After the shift, there is still awareness, but there is also space. Emotion no longer rushes directly into identity. There is a pause. A quiet internal check. Is this mine, or am I picking it up from someone else? What is actually happening here? That small gap changes everything. Instead of being swept away by emotion, they observe it. Emotional intelligence becomes structured awareness, almost strategic. They begin noticing not just words, but tone, timing, contradiction, and what is left unsaid. Energy becomes information, not instruction. They stop reacting automatically to emotional shifts. If tension rises, they don't rush to fix it. If guilt is projected, they recognize it without accepting it. They choose when to engage and when to step away. Withdrawal no longer feels like rejection, it feels like clarity. Silence becomes a tool, not avoidance. It creates space for truth to surface without force or interference. This is where empathy evolves into discernment. Discernment is not emotional coldness, it is clarity under pressure. It separates genuine vulnerability from manipulation, support from control, sincerity from performance. The empath also begins to outgrow the rescuer identity. For a long time, saving others was how they defined their worth. Being needed gave them purpose. But this role often masked a deeper pattern, the need to feel valuable through emotional responsibility. When they stop rescuing, an uncomfortable question appears: who am I without fixing others? This moment is part of individuation, what Carl Jung described as becoming psychologically whole. It requires releasing identities built for survival. The empath begins to see that constant rescue can actually prevent growth in others, keeping them dependent instead of accountable. So they shift, they listen without immediately solving. They allow discomfort where advice once rushed in. They observe patterns instead of absorbing chaos. Naturally, people notice. Some say they've changed, others feel the distance. But what changed is not compassion, it is boundary. They are no longer accessible in the same automatic way. This distance is not rejection, it is structure. It is the foundation of a more conscious self, one that no longer confuses overextension with love or emotional exhaustion with loyalty. In this state, the empath still feels everything but is no longer ruled by it. They remain connected yet centered. And in that balance, empathy finally becomes mature strength instead of emotional survival. As the empath moves deeper into this transformation, relationships begin to feel fundamentally different. The emotional weight that once defined every interaction starts to ease. Conversations no longer drain them in the same way, and there is a noticeable shift toward balance. Less emotional dependency, more mutual exchange. They stop measuring their worth by how much they give up for others. Instead, they begin measuring it by how honest they are with themselves. And while some connections naturally fade away, the ones that remain tend to be healthier, clearer, and more authentic. The death of the rescuer identity is not the end of empathy. It is its refinement. Empathy doesn't disappear, it matures. The empath still understands pain, still feels deeply, still recognizes emotional undercurrents with precision. But they no longer believe it is their responsibility to fix every form of suffering around them. They start to understand something crucial. Growth often requires discomfort, and love sometimes requires distance. So when others say, "You've changed," they are not wrong. The empath has changed, but they are no longer defined by who they save. They are defined by who they are becoming. The Sophia empath often feels unsettling to others, not because they are harsh, but because they are no longer fully transparent in the way they used to be. Before this shift, they were emotionally open books, explaining everything, oversharing feelings, justifying intentions, and constantly reassuring others so nobody felt uncomfortable. That openness made them easy to read, predictable, safe in a way that others could rely on. After the shift, that dynamic changes. They become more selective with their inner world, not secretive in a deceptive sense, but intentional. They no longer believe every thought, feeling, or vulnerability needs to be shared to be valid. Their words carry more weight because they are no longer emotionally impulsive. They listen more than they reveal. And for people who were used to constant emotional access, that restraint feels unfamiliar. Boundaries also change. In the past, saying no often came wrapped in explanation, apology, and emotional cushioning. They tried to make refusal comfortable for everyone else, even at their own expense. Now it becomes simple. I'm not available for that. That doesn't work for me. No excessive justification, no emotional self-defense, just clarity. To those who rely on guilt, pressure, or emotional leverage, this calm directness can feel intimidating. But what they are actually encountering is self-respect without distortion. The Sophia empath also stops feeding manipulation cycles. Where they once reacted quickly, defending, explaining, overcorrecting, they now pause. They notice the hidden blame in polite statements, the subtle pressure behind urgency, the emotional hooks disguised as concern, and instead of engaging emotionally, they stay grounded. Sometimes they respond with simple clarity. Sometimes they choose silence. Either way, the pattern loses power because the emotional reaction it depends on never arrives. This is where the psychological shift becomes undeniable. They also begin to mirror behavior with calm precision, not as retaliation, but as alignment. Disrespect is met with firmness. Distortion is met with clarity. Truth is repeated without escalation. It feels unsettling to those who expect emotional flexibility because the empath is no longer bending to keep harmony intact. They are reflecting reality as it is. And that reflection can feel exposing. Because the Sophia empath sees patterns quickly, contradictions in behavior, insecurity masked as confidence, validation seeking disguised as connection. And since they are no longer dependent on approval, they don't pretend not to see it. Their energy changes. They become less reactive, less impressed, less emotionally available to performance. And that subtle withdrawal communicates something powerful, awareness without attachment. This is why they can feel threatening in rooms where illusion once went unchallenged. Not because they are aggressive, but because they are no longer easily influenced. Approval used to shape their behavior, how much they gave, how much they tolerated, how much they explained. When that need dissolves, their presence becomes steady, unshakable in a quiet way. They no longer chase connection. They allow it. They no longer argue to prove goodness. They live it through action. And this grounded stability changes everything. Some people rise to meet it. Others withdraw from it. Both reactions confirm the same truth. The shift is real. At their core, the Sophia empath is not trying to dominate anyone. They are simply integrated. Warmth and strength exist at the same time. Compassion is no longer self-sacrifice. Boundaries no longer require anger. Because they are no longer divided internally, their presence feels coherent. But the journey to this state is rare, not due to lack of sensitivity, but because it demands radical honesty. The empath must confront fear of abandonment, guilt around saying no, trauma-bonded patterns of rescue, and addiction to external validation. Letting go of these patterns feels like loss at first, loss of identity, loss of familiar roles, loss of emotional certainty. But beneath that discomfort is something deeper, selfhood. The Sophia shift begins the moment the empath stops abandoning themselves to maintain connection, because it dismantles the illusions they have built around identity. The empath is forced to confront the hidden ways they have been both protecting themselves and limiting their own growth at the same time. It becomes a direct meeting with their shadows, insecurities, and emotional conditioning, something many are unwilling to face honestly. This transition also comes with a cost. Relationships begin to shift or dissolve. People who benefited from patterns of overgiving, constant reassurance, emotional rescue, or approval seeking often resist the change. Sometimes it is subtle, sometimes it is direct, but the resistance is real. And for the empath, this can feel painful because these connections often carried emotional weight, history, and meaning. But the Sophia shift rarely allows everything to stay intact. When old dynamics no longer function, certain people naturally drift away. Not out of punishment or conflict, but because the emotional structure that once held the relationship together is gone. This is not rejection, it is evolution. And evolution always involves release. What once felt like loss slowly reveals itself as clearing space for something healthier, more stable, and more reciprocal. Solitude becomes a necessary stage in this process, not as isolation but as recalibration. The empath begins learning how to exist without constantly orienting themselves around other people's emotional needs. In solitude, they can finally observe their inner world without interruption. Thoughts, reactions, patterns, and unconscious behaviors that were previously drowned out by external demands. This space becomes essential. It allows emotional clarity to form. It teaches self-awareness without distortion. It builds a kind of inner grounding that cannot develop while constantly responding to others. In solitude, patience grows. Discernment strengthens. Self-respect becomes internal rather than dependent on external validation. These qualities are foundational for anyone stepping into the full depth of integrated empathy. The reason so many empaths never reach the Sophia shift is not because they lack sensitivity or intelligence, but because the process is deeply uncomfortable. It disrupts emotional familiarity. It challenges long-held beliefs about love, worth, and identity. It requires letting go of roles that once provided meaning, even if those roles were rooted in self-abandonment. It demands radical honesty. It asks the empath to step back from relationships that no longer align, to stop over-identifying with being needed, and to sit in the discomfort of not constantly being emotionally useful to others. Most importantly, it requires releasing the version of themselves that survived through pleasing, fixing, and absorbing, and stepping into something unfamiliar: wholeness. At the center of this journey lies a simple but confronting question. Are you evolving, or are you still protecting the version of yourself that keeps you small? This question is not abstract. It functions as a mirror. It forces awareness of fear, attachment, and emotional dependency. It reveals where comfort has been prioritized over growth and where old patterns are still being defended. Only when this question is faced honestly does transformation become possible. Because the Sophia shift is not just emotional growth, it is integration. It is the point where empathy is no longer driven by fear, guilt, or approval, but guided by clarity, discernment, and inner strength. In conclusion, the Sophia shift represents a deep inner transformation in the empath's journey, from emotional reactivity to conscious awareness, from self-sacrifice to self-respect, and from rescuing others to reclaiming the self. It is not the loss of empathy, but its evolution. The empath still feels, still understands, still connects, but no longer at the cost of their own stability. What once was emotional absorption becomes emotional discernment. What once was automatic overgiving becomes intentional presence. Through this shift, relationships naturally reorganize. Some fade, some transform, and some deepen into healthier, more balanced forms. The empath no longer measures their worth through sacrifice or approval, but through alignment with their truth. Solitude, once feared, becomes a space of clarity. Boundaries, once softened for acceptance, become expressions of self-respect. Silence, once uncomfortable, becomes strength. At its core, this transformation asks a single unavoidable question. Are you living from awareness or from patterns that keep you emotionally confined? Those who choose awareness step into a more integrated version of themselves, where empathy is no longer vulnerability without protection, but intelligence guided by clarity and inner power. The Sophia shift ultimately is not about becoming less sensitive. It is about becoming whole.